Hey guys, welcome back to Start Manga. I'm your host Spencer, and today we're going to learn how to draw some ears. Ears are often overlooked when people learn to draw the head because you can get away with very simple designs and people rarely notice. But if you want to take your characters to the next level, then it's time to buckle down and learn to properly draw some ears. If you like this video and you want to see more, please like and subscribe to help me out. Alright, let's get started. Now, the first thing that we should look at when we're drawing any part of the body is the anatomy, and that's the same with the ear. One thing that's important to know with the ear is that despite the fact that there's a lot of complex anatomy to it, we don't need to know every name of everything. I've left a diagram here so that you can see it, but essentially what you really need to know is the structure and the shape of the ear. The ear sort of works like a megaphone. Basically, we have an inner portion, which I'll show you is right here. There's a red part that I'm drawing. That's the darkest part of the ear. That's where sound is traveling towards when we use our ears. And then we have this outer shell of the ear that really makes up our fundamental shape that we're looking for. If we were to zoom in here and try to draw the shape from a front view, what we really end up seeing is that megaphone shape. So we have a cone shape that the ear comes out in. We can see that the entrance of the ear is this inner circle. It's fairly dark in there, and then the outside of the ear works like a megaphone. And if we were to draw an actual megaphone in here, you could really see that distinction, right? This is what our ear would look like in a very simplified format. Let's get rid of all of that and go back to our anatomy diagram over here. So despite the fact that anatomy is not that important to the ear, what we can do is have a basic understanding of what all the pieces are. You don't need to memorize the names, but understanding the form of each of them is what's really important. So the lobe of the ear is going to be very important when we're trying to make up the shape of the ear. The inner ear really doesn't look complete if we don't include this antihelical fold, the antihelix, and antertragus, I'm guessing it's called. Basically, this part of the ear that comes out. It's very prominent in most people's ears. And if you're really trying to make the ear look realistic, then you're going to need to include all those parts in order for people to understand what they're looking at. Now, the next most important thing to look at is form. Understanding form is what allows us to know what the ear really looks like to the viewer and what the most important parts are to the ear. So let's draw some form lines. Basically, all I want to do in this section is draw some lines over top of the ear in a few different angles that show us the shape. So these red parts that I'm drawing are parts of the ear that are coming towards us. In a sense, they're where the light is likely going to hit if we have a certain lighting on the ear, of course. And I'm not going to do every single bit of the ear in every angle. I just want to show you the most important pieces. Basically, when those parts are coming towards you, other parts are sinking away from you into the ear, into the body. So as you can see in those blue areas, we're folding underneath parts of the red area. And what that means is that we're going to get a big shadow when there's light coming from above, as you can see in this image. The same thing applies to this section right here. The ear is pushing out in this part, and then it folds down both directions, actually. If we use a dotted line here, you can see where the lines are sort of going. All this is to say, when we look at the ear, we want to understand the actual form, the structure of it. When parts are coming towards us, they tend to grab the highlights, which we can see in these white bits, which I'll use. Let's use green to show that there's some highlights on these parts of the ear. These highlights help us understand what we're actually looking at. If we don't have things like highlights, lighting, and shadows, we don't really understand the 3D structure. And if you're having trouble making your ears look like ears or look defined, it's probably because you're lacking those values. If I was to draw an ear, it's important for me to understand that I need that proper structure. So if we're drawing a really simple version here, right, we include the lobe down here. We want to make sure that there's parts of the ear that sink in. And if we follow this guideline, not really guideline, we're just using an actual reference image here. We follow this actual reference image, we can see that if I follow and put my lines where the big shadows are, especially, right, I make them a little thicker around here, it gives the impression that it gets darker in that area, which it does, right? Following that guideline, right, maybe I make it a bit lighter here because it sort of sinks into the skin. This very clearly looks like an ear, and we've only used line art, right? So when you're drawing something like manga and a lot of your art is just coming from lines, it's really important to understand the forms that you're working with. We have forms like this that are coming towards us, and then other forms that are sinking in. And if we can understand that, we, one, can make the ear look more like an ear, and two, can actually show the shadowed forms. And it essentially makes it so that we can really understand what we're looking at, and our audience especially can understand what they're looking at. So when you're learning to draw the ear, look at these different angles, like this one, for example, where we're looking from the front, and practice drawing those form lines. Right? So I want to make sure I understand, okay, this part of the ear is coming towards me. It's very cylindrical. This part of the ear is also very cylindrical. It's very prominent in the ear, and so we understand that that's where the light is going to be hitting. You can see, like I said, the light is going to be hitting there. These are the brighter parts of the ear. When we get to the darker parts, when we use this blue, it's because it's going underneath those protruding shapes. Right? Same in this area. We can see that it's very dark because it's folding underneath the parts that are pushing out. Hopefully this is all making sense. I really want to make sure you guys understand that the form is really key here. Let's do one last angle. I want to go from the back of the ear now. If we look at the back of the ear, the same thing applies, but our shape has somewhat changed. And it really shows you that megaphone shape that we're looking at. Right? So if I draw a little outline here, right? This is the same sort of shape that I drew before, where it looked like a megaphone, right? And even if I drew a little handle here, a little speaker head here, you could probably see it wouldn't be too hard to speak into this. Like that, right? Okay, let's get rid of that, and we'll look at the forms just quickly. So you can see what the forms of the ear look like from behind. Same idea. We're looking for forms that come towards us, right? And understanding their shape in 3D space. And with the back of the ear, you don't have as much of the concave shapes, the parts that are going away from you, but this area of the ear is fairly flat. There's a bit of roundness to it, but you can think of it as a flat shape. If you want to think of it as rounded and really overdo that megaphone look, that's perfectly fine, right? You can round this part out as well. But I find if you're interested in keeping your forms asymmetrical, it's better to not have two very rounded shapes beside each other. But you can do something like this. And when it comes to form, that's all you really need to know is how does the shape look when you look at it? It's kind of oversimplified way of saying it, but all I'm really trying to get at is when you look at an ear and you're understanding the forms that you're working with, do you know where the shadows should be placed, where the light should be placed? And this form exercise really helps with that. So take a photo of an ear, even the ones that I have right here, and go through the entirety of it, wrapping it in those guidelines, wrapping lines, until you understand, oh, this is the part that comes towards me, this is the part that's away from me, oh, this is where the shadows tend to go because of this. It really helps you understand the 3 dimensions that you're working with these ears. And next, let's focus on the placement of the ear. The ear tends to be placed around the middle of the side of the skull, and I'll explain that using the Loomis method. If you understand the Loomis method, this will be a lot easier, but go look into that before you follow this. Basically, using my red pen here, if I was to draw a Loomis head, right? Big circle for the side of the head here, and then I just drew in a very basic front of the face with a jaw, right? The jaw should end about there, the neck comes out from both ends, and we draw a little cross to understand where the middle of the head is from the eyebrows, right? So our eyebrows are our first horizontal guideline. We might have one at the bottom of the nose and then the bottom of the chin. This head does not perfectly represent the Loomis method. As you can see, the ear is below this line. If I was to get rid of this image just to show you, if we had a very, very basic Loomis head here, this is super rough. Generally, when you're drawing in the ear, you want it to be on this guideline going between the bottom of the nose and the bottom of the eyebrow, or generally just on the eyebrow ridge, right? This tends to be where your ear would go. And it doesn't always have to be this way, but this is a good guideline to understand where your ear should be placed in most cases. If we go back to this image of the guy, you can see that the ear placement does not match up, and that's okay. In a lot of cases, your ears are not going to be in the exact right place. And a reason that that's important is because oftentimes the head is not looking completely straight. If you were to look up, for example, so if I drew a head looking up, right? We'd have our character looking like this. Their ears, we had a neck there just so you can see, would be lower down. And that's because if we were to look at it from the side, right? The character's looking up like this, their jaw is like that, or the front of their face, and then their jaw is like that. Their ear is just lower down than it would be if that face was looking perfectly sideways. Let's resize this so you can see this properly. I want to make this very clear. This eye line is matching up. And we can see that our ears generally are in very similar places. It's not perfect in the example that I'm showing you here, but it gives you the general picture, right? When we look up, our ears are placed differently. They go lower. And the ears are an especially good guideline for understanding where a character is looking. You may not do this knowingly, but when you look at a person, you're trying to understand where they're looking. You're looking at the ears in a lot of cases. If we wanted to do that from the front, we again use the Loomis method. So let's draw that in. We have this woman's head. And we can see that our ears are actually very much following the guideline in this case. Right? Again, not perfect. Her ears are a little bit above where the bottom of her nose is, but it's pretty close. It really just changes based on whether a person has a certain nose shape or a certain ear shape, how old they are, which we'll get to later. But essentially, if you're following the Loomis method, the ears generally will be fit between the guideline of the eyebrow and the guideline of the bottom of the nose. And so if you can fit your ears into that space, no matter where they go, the head will generally look correct, so long as you understand the anatomy and form of the ear, which we already went through. The next thing to understand is the stylization of your ears. I like to think of style as coming in 3 or 4 main categories. The first one is realism, and that's just where your ear looks fairly realistic. This painting by Naranbatar Ganbold is a pretty good example of a very realistic ear. If we were to look at this zoomed in, of course there's paint strokes in there, but you can understand that that is an ear. It has great form, it has great anatomy, and it has great structure. And you can understand perfectly that that's an ear. Excuse my keyboard showing up there. We can also do this in a manga style. I don't remember what manga this is from, but I will leave this in the description. But you can see that despite the fact that this is in a very manga cartoony type of style, we still see the full anatomy of the ear and the complete form. So we understand where parts are getting darker. We understand that this red part here is where the ear is very dark, and we see more darkness where the eardrum would be, or the ear canal, I should say. And we also have parts that are generally lighter, which is where our forms are coming out. So if we remember our form examples, it follows the same path as we saw when we were using the actual ear reference photos. And so this is clearly heavily referenced, and it's a good example of a realistic ear in a style that is not necessarily super realistic. So it really depends on what you're looking for in your ears. Doesn't have to be super realistic. We can also make it more of a common manga style. And we'll see something like that in Naruto, where the ears are following that general form guideline, right? So again, if I just were to draw this in, we could see that there is some level of anatomy and structure to this ear, but it's very simplified in comparison to the more realistic example we saw earlier. And the same thing applies to this other drawing, also from Naruto, where we see the form of the ear is still there. We still see the indents of the ear where the shadows would be. Kishimoto has just decided not to draw the shadows in, and that's perfectly fine because we still understand that this is an ear. And a big thing about ears when you're drawing them is people tend to not look at them, which is why we can get away with getting rid of a lot of these shadow shapes and things, because really the focus of this panel is his face, right? Same thing with this panel. The focus is really his face, a bit of the background. We don't really look at his ears the way that we do in some other shots or paintings, for example. And understanding when to cut down on detail is really important when you're a manga artist, because you have to be quick with a lot of your turnaround of your drawings. And so drawing in all the details of the ear could be good if you wanted it to be super realistic, but it's not necessary, and that's an important thing to understand. Next, we have a very cartoony style. Again, we can have just straight up cartoons. This is a chibi version of Sasuke, I believe. And the ear is super simple. We can see that there is some level of structure to it, but it's not anywhere near realistic. And even in this drawing, where we have a semi-realistic anime portrayal, we still see barely any details in the ears. And this is going back to the concept I just talked about, where we don't have to include details where they're not necessary. The importance of this panel is understanding that there's a big light below her. And so putting in a bunch of details in the ear would just make the drawing more complicated, and it's completely unnecessary. So this artist has intelligently avoided drawing in a lot of concepts to the ear. They just drew in mainly the face and the lighting on the hair, which is what it was important when they were drawing this. So leaving details out, not necessarily a bad thing, and doesn't really make the drawing look less realistic, even if the ear itself is very unrealistic. And finally, we have ears that really just don't have any detail at all. This is more of a miscellaneous category because for some reason in Jujutsu Kaisen, the ear anatomy is there and yet it's also not. So for example, again, this drawing is focused predominantly on the face. The emotions of the face, we're ignoring a lot of the hair detail, but this ear, although technically correct, doesn't really make a lot of sense. We can see that if we were to draw in the 4 lines, let me get a red pen here and we can zoom in. If we were to draw in the form lines of this ear, it does technically have all the working parts of the ear in the same fashion. You know, we've got a bit of a lobe here. All the parts of the ear are somewhat there, but if you were to look at it from a distance, although you can tell it's an ear in context, if this shape was just by itself, it would be quite confusing to look at and we wouldn't really know what's going on. And so for this piece specifically, that doesn't matter. Again, because we're really focused on the face and a little bit of the details of where the character is, most likely. And this is also probably a smaller panel than it appears on screen right now. So you have to pick and choose your battles. Do you want the ear to be super detailed? How much effort are you willing to put into the ear compared to what people are actually going to see when they look at the full panel? So keep that in mind when you're stylizing your drawings. And finally, some special stuff to pay attention to. Mainly age is a very important part of how an ear looks. For example, if we were to look at the ear of a baby versus the ear of an elderly person, the main difference that we see is a bit of sagging in a lot of the skin. And the reason for that is because in ears, and similarly in the nose, the cartilage inside your body just continues to grow. Generally, you'll find it in places like this. Let me draw that in so you can actually see. Right here, the reason that it sags so much is 1, because of gravity, and that's the reason that you'd also have all these wrinkles. But 2, it's because of the cartilage continually growing. That part of your body never stops growing. And so with older characters, you'll see that there's just more skin and more flesh on the ear. And so when we draw exaggerated versions of that, you might see that a character has a really, really large earlobe because they're old, and it signifies that. With babies, you tend to want to have small and very simplified ears because babies in general look more cartoonish when it comes to drawings. So keep that in mind. There's not much to do outside of that, just deeper shadows on the older person, more wrinkles, more lines, and larger earlobes to show their age. And now that we've gone through all the things that you can do to draw ears, all the stylizations, the anatomy, the form, the placement, I'm going to draw a few examples of ears, some on actual characters, some just by themselves, so you can see all the different angles, and it'll give you a bit of reference of how to actually draw ears rather than just me telling you. So let's get started with that. Alright, that's about everything you need to know to start drawing some proper ears on your characters. Again, if you liked the video, please make sure to like and subscribe to help me make more of these in the future, and leave a comment to let me know what topic you'd like me to cover next. I'm Spencer from Start Manga, and I'll see you later.